Ну, что еще старенькое мы услышим?
Hello, I'm very pleased to welcome our next session and our next speaker. Our next speaker will be Anna Stetsenko from the University of Verona in Italy. Her doctoral research focused on the opera libretto in the context of Russian literature. Currently, she is serving as a research fellow at the University of Verona, where she contributes to a project developing the digital archive of 18th century Russian theatre texts. Her research interests encompass opera, theatre, literature, and early 19th centuries, and the interdisciplinary connections between literature and other artistic forms. So her paper today, studying the Russian 18th century librettos as a literary genre, is something that we are very warmly welcoming now. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое. Я не знаю, Анна, если бы ты хотела сказать вступительное слово, как мы договаривались.
Да, чтобы вот дать понять всем.
Мгм.
Maria, sorry for we agreed with Larissa with a sort of short presentation on my part because our papers are together in one session regarding the same project. So I would like to present it shortly before in order to let Anna go into her topic without the need of presenting again the project. So am I allowed?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so I will proceed by reading the sort of short presentation of our project, which is called Rossiysky Teatr, Music Sources on the Russian Empire from the 1730s to the year 1836. Despite the attention researchers have paid to music theater of the 18th century Russian Empire, the source study approach to this topic still needs to be updated. A most promising form of updating is the systematization of existing information using digital humanities and work with big data. New technologies partially simplify access to materials for researchers worldwide, thus contributing to the growth of interest in this discipline, allowing researchers to update the analysis of sources and their quantitative systematization. Opening our session, I will present the project Rossiysky Teatr, which I currently direct at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures of the University of Verona, within the frame of the Excellence Project Inclusive Humanities 2023-27. Our project involves the creation of a digital archive of music sources connected with operatic life in the Russian Empire in the long 18th century. It consists of collecting primary sources necessary for textual analysis, reconstruction, and systematic study of specific monuments of music culture in their context of genesis. Its chronological frame covers the period from the 1730s to the year 1836. Of course, these are to be intended as conventional dates that we choose to limit the chronological span, and they correspond to the official beginning of operatic life in the Russian Empire, as Zlotnitskaya was saying before, up to the first staging of Glinka's Жизнь за царя, which is conventionally considered the first Russian opera. In this project, we espouse this traditional periodization, which I commented on other occasions, trying anyway to avoid any teleological approach. It's just a convention. At the same time, the geographic area is the territory of the Russian Empire, intended in purely historical terms. The archive will include materials related to the theatrical stagings that took place within the specific borders. This aims at providing as much as possible information about the multilingual character of the theatrical activity of the Russian Empire in the selected chronological span. In fact, the archive will include sources and documents produced not only in Russian language, but also in other languages, which makes it possible to create a panoramic overview of the theatrical activity of that time, outside the anachronistic musicological approach based on linguistic and/or national subdivision, Russian theater, Italian theater, and so on and so forth. The process of creating the archive consists of several stages, the first of which is compiling a list of operatic titles produced on the theatrical stages of the Russian Empire in the specified era, or intended for production but never performed on stage. Another step consists of searching for specific materials that witness the production, the production of a particular performance, indicating their location and including, when possible, digitized reproductions of the documents. At this stage of the project, we are concentrating on certain categories of sources, namely printed and manuscript librettos, which include those printed directly for theatrical performances and those published outside the theatrical context in anthologies, collected works of authors, and so on, which will be the object of Anna's paper, actually. Manuscript scores, or because the case of printed score is very rare at this stage, piano scores or cembalist parts, mainly in handwritten as well, and separate parts, be they orchestral or vocal. Additionally, we envisage to collect such materials as sketches of stage sets, theater playbills, public press advertisements, reviews, chronicles, and memoirs and letters. The process of data entry entails a long stage of fact-checking and further data systematization, which means concentrating available information in one single platform according to the spirit of the Svodny Catalogue, but with a view focused on the research needs and not on individual libraries' repertory. The scholarly community will eventually benefit from detailed data collection, their systematic study, and digitization in several respects, filling in persisting gaps in the history of Russian opera in the long 18th century, confirming or re-establishing the authorship of music and lyrics of individual works, restoring individual works according to scientific criteria of textual analysis, and publishing critical or documentary editions of the most interesting sources. Getting important information on direct participants in performances and reconstructing their movements and career in the empire, thus contributing to the study of mobility of artists throughout Europe. And then tracking the audience's or readers' perception and studying the fortune of specific works, making renewed performances possible, as was the case with Cecilia Bartoli's CD in 2014, or the staging of Francesco Arraia's Cephaliprocris on the part of the Ensemble Solisti Caterini Velikai in 2019. The Rossiysky Theatre Archive may become the first large-scale digital project dedicated to the history of opera in the Russian Empire, thus reconnecting the cultural history of modern-day Russia to that of the rest of Europe, with the perspective of recreating the grounds of peace against cultural claims of specific powers' nationalism. Another relevant aspect of creating this archive is the search for points of contact and possible cooperation between researchers from different humanities fields involved in the opera theater and people involved in belonging to different scholarly communities, such as that of computer science. In this perspective, the research group of the Rossiysky Theatre Project invites libraries, foundation, archives, institutes, organizations, and colleagues, of course, pursuing similar goals and interested in revealing the potential and functionality of these materials to cooperate. Individuals expressing interest in cooperation and contributing to the project will be considered partners of the project itself, and their contribution is planned to be clearly expressed in the front matter of the resulting website we are currently preparing. The partnership involves an active exchange of ideas and informations, participation in seminars, conferences, and roundtables. We had one workshop, for instance, in January, where we gathered together experts in the field of computer science, musicology, and literary studies. Before I leave the floor to my colleague, I therefore invite you all to contribute to the project to the extent you will consider possible. In this session, we will show you some immediate results of our research so that you can appreciate, hopefully, its impact in our study field. So that's all, folks, for now. And please, Anna, the floor
Thank you
is...
very much. Thank you, Anna, for the presentation of our project. Unfortunately, I have to cut my paper because of time, but I think it will be better for all of us. Я буду говорить на русском, несмотря на заявленный в программе английский. Если позволите, сейчас я Включу свою презентацию. Так. Видно? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Хорошо. Начну с того, что первые каталоги, начну с того, что вообще музыкальные архивы электронные в основном существуют как архивы именно либретто. Первые не только электронные, но и опубликованные в прошлом, бумажные. Да, крупную реформу, крупным таким событием стал каталог Клаудио Сартори. В 1990-х годах вышло 7 томов каталога итальянских либретто Клаудио Сартори от истоков итальянской оперы до начала XIX века. Но, конечно же, Сартори не был первым, кто придумал саму систему каталогизации либретто. До него еще были такие каталоги, как каталог Альфреда Водкина, например. Это каталог либретто, хранящихся в библиотеке при консерватории Брюсселя, или известный каталог библиотеки Конгресса, либретто, написанных до XIX века. Опять же, составителем этого каталога был Оскар Соннек. Это 1914 год. Или, например, каталог Уго Сизини, каталог либретто, хранящихся при консерватории Болоньи. Этот каталог вышел в 1943 году. Сартори собрал он на основе всех этих каталогов сделал свой каталог. Это действительно самый обширный каталог оперных либретто в 20 веке, если мы говорим именно о бумажных, как мы их можем сейчас назвать, бумажных каталогах. И на основе каталога Сартори возник знаменитый проект университета Болоньи Corago, который собирает не только данные о либретто, но и старается оцифровать все доступные либретто в разных библиотеках мира. Опять же, эти каталоги, в отличие от нашего, который представила ранее Анна, эти каталоги все основным их критерием является язык, да, то есть Corago тоже сконцентрирован в основном на сборе италоязычных каталогов, италоязычных либретто, извините. Цель Corago во многом сходна с целью Клаудио Сартори. Клаудио Сартори в предисловии к своему каталогу писал, что основная цель вообще всего этого действия — это реконструкция театральных событий прошлого. И у Corago, можно сказать, та же самая цель, поскольку кроме непосредственно выходных данных либретто, в этом архиве собраны имена исполнителей, места театральных событий и так далее. Я просто очень коротко в своем докладе объясню, как изучение либретто может способствовать способствовать изучению литературного контекста. Сначала расскажу очень коротко, опять же, об истории каталогизации либретто в России. Как таковой ее, наверное, можно сказать, что и не было. Были попытки собрать разные театральные сочинения в одной публикации. Например, это грамматический словарь 1787 года. Дали показания по алфавиту всех российских театральных сочинений и так далее, с указанием переводчиков и составителей музыки. Но если внимательно прочитать этот словарь, то мы увидим, что в нем очень много пробелов. Например, либретто оперы Альцеста Сумарокова указано только первое из 2 изданий, и наоборот, Гамлет — это уже не опера, но тоже театральное произведение Сумарокова. В Гамлете указано только последнее издание, то есть очень выборочное включение было в этот драматический словарь. Очень помогает в поисках, конечно же, сводный каталог русской книги гражданской печати XVIII века, который вышел в 1962-1967 годах. Но, опять же, поскольку прошло уже много времени, и многие источники, многие материалы были найдены только позднее, этот каталог тоже, можно сказать, достаточно неполный. Ну и кроме того, есть отдельные публикации, в которых мы можем почерпнуть сведения о либретто, о разных программах, о разных театральных источниках. Это, например, «Театральная жизнь России в эпоху Анны Иоанновны» или Елизаветы Петровны, Людмилы Стариковой. Каталог Стасова, вышедший в 1898 году, включал русские иностранные оперы, исполнявшиеся на сцене императорских театров в России. в 18-19 веке, но опять же, как мы видим даже из названия, все эти каталоги сконцентрируются только на одной части. То есть вот здесь, например, у Стасова не включены в его словарь оперы частных театров, да, только исполнявшиеся на сцене императорских театров. И в 1959 выходит словарь опер Григория Бернарда, опер, впервые поставленных или изданных в дореволюционной России и в СССР. Опять же, только поставленных впервые. То есть, например, многие оперы на либретто метастазио, которые уже многократно шли в Италии, в этот словарь не включены. Здесь я хотела коротко, опять же, объяснить, почему либретто, несмотря на то, что у изучения либретто как литературного жанра много противников, и один из них, например, профессор Пол Робинсон, который говорит, что либретто, поскольку это синтетический текст, он не может исследоваться чисто как литература. Я хотела с этим поспорить, но, наверное, уже не буду, опять же, потому что у нас не очень много времени. Просто сейчас я вам продемонстрирую, как даже не читая текст либретто, мы можем почерпнуть сведения о некоторых литературных тенденциях, о некоторых политических и социальных тенденциях, которые нам могут пригодиться в исследовании дальнейшей литературы, дальнейшего создания оперной драматической литературы. Например, перед вами либретто «Селевка», да, опер «Селевко» Джузеппе Бонекки и Франческо Араи 1744 года. Премьера состоялась в Москве. Здесь вы видите итальянскую и русскую версию. Если внимательно прочитать, на обложке итальянской версии указано, что эта опера шла в честь торжеств из-за заключения мира между Россией и Швецией, да, это русско-шведская война 1741-1743 года. На русской обложке указано прилагательное заключение вечного мира, да, на итальянской обложке этого нет. То есть здесь, опять же, это согласно, например, жанру оды, да, вечный мир, вечная тишина, известная ода Ломоносова 1747 года, Елизавете, царей царства земных, отрады, возлюбленная тишина. Вечность, поскольку известно, да, что придворные поэты в своих одах, когда восхваляли русских императриц, императоров, писали об их царствовании как о наступлении некого золотого века застывшего, да, после него уже ничего не будет, ничего не случится, потому что это уже пик благосостояния, благоденствия и так далее. И, кстати сказать, итальянское либретто «Селевка», вот опять же, я проводила поиски на сайте Corago, и итальянская версия «Селевка» не находится, нет ее, этой версии нет в российских библиотеках. Согласно Corago, одна версия находится в Венской национальной библиотеке, а в российских библиотеках ее или нет, или пока что она там не найдена. То есть, опять же, в пользу подобного проекта, подобного каталога, то, что мы можем определить местонахождение разных источников. Итальянская версия «Селевка» в российских библиотеках относится только к 1761 году, то есть это уже последующая версия, второе издание, вторая реплика, и даже переводческие попытки сравнить русского «Селевка» и итальянского «Селевка», они в основном опирались на эту версию, а не на первоначальную, что само по себе не является филологически верным. Следующее, например, опять же, отличие от итальянских опер, выходивших в Италии, я нигде не видела, я не видела на итальянских операх, на итальянских либретто, опубликованных не в России, указания происхождения композиторов или либретистов. Здесь мы видим, что на обложке «Селевка» указано, что музыка написана Giuseppe Bonecchi, флорентийцем, да, Giuseppe Bonecchi, фиорентино, и слова, извините, и музыка Франческо Араи, наполитано. И то же самое в русском переводе. Доктор Giuseppe Bonecchi, флорентиец, и Франческо Араи, неаполитанец. Почему было важно, опять же, мы можем предполагать, почему было важно указывать на обложках оперных либретто происхождение авторов? Потому что Российская империя в то время это молодая империя, было важно подчеркнуть, что эта империя точно так же могущественна, точно так же межнациональна, как и другие. Нужно было убедить своих подданных и иностранных подданных в том, что эта империя привлекает иностранцев. Еще важный аспект, который остается неизученным, это указание авторства. Указание авторства переводчиков, авторства композиторов, либретистов. Например, если вернуться к либретто «Селевка», в русской версии не указано имя переводчика, и мы до сих пор не знаем точно, кто был переводчиком «Селевка». Скорее всего, Адам Асуфьев, но, опять же, пока что это еще не доказано. В либретто Евдоксии Венчиной 1751 года имя переводчика уже указано. Изучение большого количества либретто, да, наш архив, он должен помочь составлять крупные статистические данные. Изучение большого количества оперных либретто позволит выявить, как часто и почему, при каких обстоятельствах иногда имя переводчика указывалось, иногда не указывалось. То же самое, например, касается различных предисловий и вступительных слов к либретто. Почему иногда автор либретто снабжал свой текст предисловиями, иногда нет. Тогда предисловия начали писать композиторы, кому и когда либретто посвящались, и так далее, и так далее. Все это важно для литературоведческого понимания контекста эпохи. Опять же, мы даже не читаем текст, мы сейчас смотрим только на внешний вид оперных либретто. Это, можно сказать, такой смежный аспект между литературоведением и книговедением. Сюда даже входит, например, изучение внешнего вида именно книжечек, да, размера, на какой бумаге они печатались, потому что мы знаем, что, например, для членов императорской семьи и для почетных гостей, зрителей либретто печатались на другой бумаге, чем те, которые были предназначены для широкого распространения, и так далее, и так далее. Важным вопросом является отношение самих авторов либретто к их текстам. Да, мы знаем, что в отличие от итальянской оперы, в России, по крайней мере, русские авторы очень серьезно относились к своим текстам. Главным автором долго считался именно либретист, а сами авторы часто называли себя любители литературы, любители словесных знаний и так далее. Например, в опере, сейчас не помню точно, но это уже 80-е годы, 18 века, опера «Матросские шутки», анонимная, мы не знаем, кто был ее автором. На обложке написано только «Оперу сочинил любитель литературы». То есть написание оперы считалось литературным занятием. Вот опять же, я говорю написание оперы, имею в виду слова, потому что в России вплоть до первой трети XIX века сочинять оперу имелось в виду сочинять слова. Но об этом я еще скажу немножко позже. Что еще важно в оформлении оперных либретто? Например, здесь вы видите первую оперу, которая шла в России в 1736 году, «La forza dell'amore e dell'odio», «Сила любви и ненависти». Миланская версия, итальянская, 1734 года, и русская версия 1736. Если посмотреть, как оформлялись арии в итальянской версии, они оформлялись точно так же, как во всех итальянских либретто, начиная, наверное, с самого начала оперного жанра. Я вот здесь выделила оформление арии. Арии оформлялись с отступом от первой строки, это так называемое дакапо, да, оформление дакапо, АБА, когда поется первый куплет, потом второй, потом опять первый и так далее. В итальянской версии, напечатанной в России, появляется курсив. В итальянских либретто, вышедших не в России, нигде, по крайней мере, я не видела, я их пересмотрела великое множество, я не видела, чтобы арии обозначались курсивом. В русской версии курсив исчезает, и появляется просто менее крупный шрифт. Здесь, опять же, мое предположение, что курсив появляется в российской печати, активно появляется в российской печати только в середине, даже не в середине, а, наверное, в начале 30-х годов, и русский читатель просто еще не умел читать курсив, ему было сложно читать курсив, поэтому арии выделялись не курсивом, а более мелким шрифтом. И в 1774 году, например, да, в опере «Луций Вер», апостол Дрена, Марко Кольтеллини и Томмазо Траэтто, курсив уже появляется и в русскоязычном тексте. Да? То есть мы на примере либретто можем отследить, как вообще русский читатель учился читать, да, тот самый гражданский шрифт. Мы знаем, что он появился задолго до появления оперы в России, но тем не менее вот с курсивом у русского читателя, видимо, были проблемы, хотя курсив использовался, например, в разных медицинских словарях, специальные иностранные термины писались курсивом, но когда речь шла о каком-то крупном фрагменте текста, курсив, наверное, это опять же предположение, повторюсь, было трудно читаемым. Ну и возвращаясь к вопросу о жанровом определении и самоопределении оперных либретто, очень интересно, что слово либретто в русский язык входит очень тяжело, очень сложно адаптируется к русскому языку. Мы знаем, что Тредьяковский переводил интермедио метастазио импресарио с Канарских островов, да, импресарио де Изо Канария. Слово либретто он переводил как опера. Опять же, здесь, извините, у меня здесь итальянская вставка, которой не должно быть. Здесь пример из указа императорского двора книжной лавки, который приказывает печатать оперы «Цефалопрокрис», 1756 год. В 1956 году в Италии невозможно увидеть словосочетание «напечатать оперу», да, «stampare opera», печатают либретто. В русском языке слово либретто почему-то встречает какое-то активное сопротивление. И это длится вплоть до начала XIX века. В 1805 году в «Московском курьере» появляется рецензия на «Русалку». Кто не видел эту любезную оперу, кто не читал ее, тот неотменно должен быть исключен из общества хорошего тона. И знаменитое письмо Пушкина Вяземскому: «Что тебе пришло в голову писать оперу? Я бы и для России не пошевелился». Это 1827 год. Естественно, Вяземский пишет не оперу, да, как мы привыкли говорить, имея в виду музыку, Вяземский пишет либретто, но Пушкин слово либретто не использует, опять же, потому что оно почему-то вот как-то сложно входит в словарный состав русского языка. Суммируя все сказанное, можно сказать, что изучение либретто, оперного либретто XVIII века и последующих веков может проходить с точки зрения переводческого аспекта, да, то есть это именно лингвистическое сравнение двух переводов. Я в этом докладе пропустила эту часть, потому что предполагаю, что в зале не так много лингвистов. Библиографический аспект, да, изучение как раз сопутствующих элементов, да, не столько сам текст, сколько оформление, обложка, указание перевода, указание тиража, указание, где и когда либретто было напечатано, при какой оказии и так далее. Потом это чисто литературоведческий аспект, который больше касается филологов, литературоведов. Здесь можно, несмотря на то, что оперный либретто — это все-таки аномальный литературный жанр, но здесь вполне можно применять все литературоведческие параметры для изучения текста, то есть язык, система персонажей и так далее, и так далее. И рецепция и чтение оперных либретто. Уточню, что отличие нашего архива, нашего каталога оперных либретто, в данном случае, да, я говорю о либретто, состоит в том, что мы собираем данные не только о либретто, которые были опубликованы в качестве отдельной книжечки для чтения во время спектакля, но и либретто, которые потом перепечатывались не только в театральном контексте, но и в сугубо литературном контексте. Конечно, в первую очередь это оперы известных авторов, да, например, Сумарокова, но и другие оперы в XVIII веке, не только Сумарокова, печатались позже, уже после спектакля, и предназначались для домашнего чтения, да, не для театрального чтения. Почему для всех этих целей больше подходит либретто XVIII века, в отличие, например, от XIX? Во-первых, потому что это эпоха формирования национальной литературы, да, то есть русский язык, русский литературный язык формировался именно в это время, и на примере либретто, особенно на либретто переводов с французского, с итальянского, можно продемонстрировать некоторые лингвистические сдвиги и меняющиеся литературные нормы. Очень помогает изучение опер, как чтение либретто, как чтение политического и социального комментария, да, потому что мы знаем, что большая часть опер шла именно при дворе, и в либретто авторы могли открыто восхвалять, скрыто критиковать, или наоборот, императорский двор. Но открыто критиковать, конечно, было невозможно, но оперное либретто во многом был таким неким комментарием тому, что происходит при дворе. Не только то, что видно всем, но и всякие разные скрытые интриги, скрытые течения, динамики, отношения разных персонажей при дворе могли быть продемонстрированы в том или ином либретто. Ну и, конечно, главная причина — это то, что именно в XVIII веке оперные либретто составляли крупную долю вообще всей существовавшей литературы, поскольку художественной литературы, да, как можно ее назвать, было еще мало, она только формировалась. Либретто составляли очень большую долю от вообще всей читаемой литературы того времени, поэтому их печатали не только для использования в театре, но, как я уже сказала ранее, именно для чтения. Поэтому именно либретто XVIII века, как нам видится, полезны не только музыковедам, но и литературоведам. Спасибо. Thank you very much.
Спасибо вам большое. Thank you very much. We'll leave questions until later. So I am now going to introduce the next participant, which we've already heard from Anna. Anna doesn't really need any introduction, really. She's Associate Professor of Russian Studies at the University of Verona, previously having taught music and Russian language at the University in Venice. Her main interests outside of this project, I think I'll leave you to read in the program booklet for the brevity and for the sake of time. Her abstract for the paper today is the Russian Fund at Library Santa Cecilia, Rome. Thank you very much.
Just a moment. Can you also can you introduce Andrea's 30 minutes left and complete.
Okay, and I'm going to, at the same time, introduce our final speaker.
Andrea Ziggiotto.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the biography up, sorry. Technical problem. Andrea Ziggiotto is a student of Master Program in Languages, Literatures and Digital Cultures, also at the University of Verona. He graduated in 2024 with Anna Giust, and his dissertation with Vladimir Adoevsky being funded, focusing on the German-influenced national romantic elements in musicological writings between 1825 and 1869. And he's and modern keyboard. His paper will be a case from the Russian fund, Dneprovskaya rusalka.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I will pass on to...
Sorry, just one thing. We have 30 minutes combined time, if we can squeeze it into that.
I will try to be quick and to leave more time to Andrea. In my paper, actually, I will present a specific branch of our project, which is based on this Russian fund, so-called Russian fund, which is a fund of sources which is located at the library of the Conservatoire Santa Cecilia in Rome. The label refers to a corpus of unpublished manuscript sources of composers active in the Russian Empire in this selected time span, which is preserved at the library in microfilm reels. These copies were obtained in I believe it was the 1962 by a commission of musicologists interested in valorizing actually the musical sources kept in Soviet libraries during a mission carried out in Leningrad. The commission was composed by musicologists Cesare Valabrega, Guglielmo Barblan and Emilia Zanetti. Barblan was the librarian of Giuseppe Verdi Conservatoire Library, and Emilia Zanetti was a musicologist and former librarian to Santa Cecilia Conservatoire Library. For several reasons, these sources were ignored after being gathered and being brought to Rome. They were almost completely ignored by the scientific community, and this resulted in these reels having been almost not only ignored by scholarships, by also ignored by librarians, with the result that the precise location of conservation of corresponding originals has remained unknown to the scholarly community, and the quantity, quality, and location of the materials themselves is also uncertain, some of them having been lost in the library. Today, tracing the exact origin of these materials is even more difficult than in the past. Okay, I'm not sharing. Let me share the presentation. Sorry. Can you see my screen? No, okay. So this is the presentation. Sorry. I was in a hurry. So I became interested in this fund several years ago in 2008 when I started systematically exploring the libraries of St. Petersburg and Moscow and facing the immediate problems that we always have when we attend these institutions. Of course, tracing the exact origins of these materials is even more difficult today, since Russia is difficult to access and evidently not facilitating in the context of international relationships. So this makes this fund even more important because we have the possibility of considering sources that are not available at the moment from Russia. So as it was said in the introduction, the project Rossiysky Theatre is a general review of sources attending operatic life in the Russian Empire. And this is part of this project, which consists in digitization, bibliographic classification, and study of these microfilm reels. The primary objective, of course, is restoring links between reproductions and original sources. So we have to analyze these materials, and the starting point is provided by a list created by the person who replaced Emilia Zanetti in the capacity of librarian of Santa Cecilia. And he provided me with this earlier list of documents he himself produced. As you can notice, there are some mistakes in the notice because if let me pinpoint to Rusalka, La Ninfa dell'Est, which is an opera that actually never existed and is actually to be better identified with the Dneprovskaya Rusalka, which will be the object of Andrea's paper. After his leave and a series of misadventure, which would be very complicated to tell you about, now the new curator officials of the library produced a new index of the source. Okay, as you can see in the first source, 30 manuscript scores were included, and the new curator official produced a new series of a new index, and this index is based on a new series of catalog cards. In the meantime, of course, another series of catalog cards has been discovered in the library, so that we have at the moment an index which has more or less this appearance, which is called Microfilm Fondo Russo Mancanti, and includes 44 handwritten catalog cards providing information about the reels, and a second series of more modern typewritten catalog cards, recently labeled as micro point, ru point, progressive number, with several sub-numbers, which correspond to the reels that are presently physically available in the library and mentioned in the previous catalog cards. So we have different classifications. Then we have the reels, which have this aspect. And considering both series of catalog cards is useful because from summing up the information we can get from one series and the other, we get further information. If, for instance, we consider one title, which is the Better I Know Best among these, Ivan Sosani by Caterino Cavos, we see that the old cards has this reference, which is a reference to the archive, which is the historical fund of the Mariinsky Theater. The signature refers to that catalog. And here we have another document which corresponds to the source, which is microfilmed, which is actually reproduced in the reel. The problem is that the two catalog cards do not correspond to the same title, to the same source, because actually this second card corresponds to another source which is preserved at the historical fund, so that probably the commission had seen both of them and reproduced one in microfilm version and the other on another support that has been lost. So that's from this information I could get some information about the history or tradition of Ivan Sosani, because it's from this mistake that we get information that two sources actually survived from the time when Cavos was active in St. Petersburg. And this also suggested a possible stemma codicum. So some other documents, this is the way the title page of the document appears, and so here we see the correct signature of the source. Here we see the information coming from the Publiczna Biblioteca, because this source is probably passed on to this library because of the reproduction, because the service of reproduction was there. And this is, I have gathered in the table the provisional results that we can now presently show about the consistency of this fund. So I have tried to order these materials in a sort of chronological order, because they sometimes resist to such a possibility. But as you can see, we have some printed librettos with their corresponding manuscript scores. We have Forza della Moda dell'Odio, an opera that has been several times mentioned today, plus Semiramide, Scipione, Mitridate, Bellerofonte, so the whole package of operas by Francesco Araya, including Cephali Procris, which has to be matched actually with those orchestral parts that are now preserved at the Conservatory Library of St. Petersburg. And then there is a group of opera belonging to the activity during the reign of Catherine the Great, operas by Galuppi. In some cases, we have both the manuscript score and some librettos. The librettos are, of course, more available at the moment. So some of these reproductions are already old, but the very importance of this fund is the quantity, the amount of manuscript scores we can actually study at the moment. So Convitat in Ifigenia in Tauride, and then a series of operas that were probably not staged by, under the umbrella of the imperial theaters, but staged by the troupe of Astarita that was active in St. Petersburg. After that, the Pridvorny Teatr was officially liquidated in 1791. And this fills in the gaps that has been highlighted in previous papers, actually, because, yes, there are several stages, but there is also a continuity that can be demonstrated by these sources, actually. And then another group of sources belonging to this time, of course, by the Maestro di Cappella, which were actually officially engaged by the court, and then a series of miscellanea, so fragments and parts of single individual space, and in this context, I think it is particularly important to pinpoint these fragments of Traetta and Cimarosa, so individual spaces that in a way attest, for instance, the possibility to restore the score of Astrea Placata, for instance, which is given as lost in some handbooks of music in Russia. So this is basically all, and this is okay, the work that all that relates to the 18th century. Then we pass on to the beginning of the 19th century, where we have Rusalka, which will be the object of next paper, and Ivan Susanin, which has been the object of my personal work. And in my final slides, I would like to show you the work I've been doing with this title, which led actually to the publication of the critical edition of the work, which is also the first edition of this title in absolute terms. This is the way the score appears in these microfilm reels. Of course, here we have no colors, so I had to go back to the historical fund of the Mariinsky Theater in order to fill the gap of the information that colors, that white and black didn't give me at the very beginning of the work. But there is possibility of doing such more or less the 90% of the work starting from these microfilm reels, and this led to the systematization, the redaction actually of the work, which has been published by SEDM in Rome last year. So basically, this is the potential work that we can do for each of the titles I haven't listed in the previous tables. Now, I think we have to hurry up to next presentation, so I leave the floor to Andrea. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so thank you for to the previous speakers and for the introduction, and also for giving me the space. It's actually my first time participating at such an important conference, so again, thank you. So I'm gonna share my presentation. Okay. Do you see the slides? Yeah? Okay. So, examining the case of Dneprovskaya Rusalka, and with its title, I convey the numerous names that this piece took on through its long-lasting presence on the German and Russian stages for the whole first half of the 19th century, means engaging with one of the most fertile and, we can say, commercially successful examples of Piridielka. In other words, the process of adopting and reworking foreign material, in this case German, gradually adapting it to the tastes and uses of the receiving audience, in this case Russian. If we want to delineate the formal boundaries of Rusalka genre identity, a productive starting point will be to classify the work within the tradition of the Волшебная opera, to use the Russian term, or what in French will be referred to as féerie. In other words, we are dealing with a hybrid fairy tale-inspired musical theatrical form that derives much of its effective power from the spectacularization of magical elements, which are introduced into a sentimental and ordinary dramatic situation, in this case a love triangle, typical of what we will find in an opéra comique. From a formal standpoint, Rusalka can thus be situated within the broader tradition of opera комическая, a composite genre that integrates musical numbers, spoken dialogue, ballet interludes, and moments of comic relief. To trace the chronological development of the pièce, we must begin by identifying its first musical incarnation, das Donauweibchen, which premiered most likely in 1798 at the Leopoldstadt Theater in Vienna. The libretto was written by Karl Hensler with music composed by Ferdinand Kauer. The opera's success in Germany was so remarkable that the authors were practically forced to produce a second part of the musical fairy tale in the same year. We now have two parts, two chapters of this saga, and it is this very material that will make its way to St. Petersburg. The arrival of the opera on the Russian stage dates back to 1802, with its first performance in German at the German Theater in St. Petersburg. Notably, setting to the sources, the premiere was attended also by members of the imperial family. This event marks the starting point for the opera's widespread diffusion and remarkable success throughout the Russian Empire. Beginning in 1803, a Russian version of the opera began to circulate in St. Petersburg. This adaptation featured a libretto translated and adapted by Nikolai Stepanovich Krasnopolsky, and music transcribed and in some section replaced by Stepan Ivanovich Davidov. Later on, this subject in Russia will be expanded with 2 additional chasti parts. The third, composed entirely by Stepan Davidov, and the fourth, featuring music by Kavos and a libretto by Shakhovskoy, will bear the designation on the title Russkaya Opera, a sign of their mostly Russian authorship in terms of text and music. When we examine the adaptation strategies adopted by the new Russian authors, we can identify at least 4 distinct levels of cultural relocation. First, the ethnographic setting. The action is transferred from the banks of the Danube, rooted in a world of medieval chivalry, to the shores of the Dnepr, set in the time of ancient Kievan Rus. This shift signals a deliberate effort to reframe the narrative within a recognizably Slavic historical and mythical context, even though this very detail will encounter negative critics concerning the global coherence of the plot. Second, the renaming of characters. For example, Hulda, our original prototypical rusalka, becomes Liesta. Minevart, the central male figure in the love triangle, becomes Vidastan, and Bertha, the human wife defending her marriage from the seductive attempts of the rusalka, of Liesta, becomes Miloslava. Third, we found a moral and thematic realignment, specifically the insertion of everyday moral values recognizable by a Russian audience. The Russian version shifts the focus toward the celebration of sacred matrimonial love, emphasizing fidelity and virtue, in contrast to the more ambiguous dynamics present in the German source. The final level, and perhaps the one that most effectively secured the saga's wide popularity, is musical reworking. If we limit our focus to the first 2 chapters of the saga, whose original source remains the Viennese prototype by Kauer and Hensler, we can observe a decisive strategy at play. Beyond the faithful transposition of the musical apparatus, both vocal and orchestral, from the German version into the Russian adaptation, the Russian composers, so I repeat, Davidov for the first part and Kavos for the second, introduce substitutions for the original German pieces, especially in terms of closed numbers, such as aria and duets. The substitutions are not incidental, but are a part of a deliberate and carefully planned musical elaboration aimed at evoking, through musical language, thematic material drawn from Russian folklore, a corpus of musical references collectively recognized by the target audience as part of their national cultural heritage. And it is precisely from the standpoint of this musical translation slash reworking that the fate of the rusalka, intended as a marker of musical and theatrical trends within the multicultural landscape of the 19th century St. Petersburg, intersects with the analytical work on primary musical sources carried out within the Rossiysky Theatr project at the University of Verona. In this case, we refer specifically to the manuscript score that was held, or should have been held, at the library of the Santa Cecilia Conservatory in Rome. This document pertains to the musical setting of the second part, the second chast of what would eventually become the celebrated Russian tetralogy centered on the character of Liesta ili Dneprovskaya rusalka. What I'm presenting here is a comparison that I constructed between the manuscript score of Das Donauweibchen, Part 2, the Viennese prototype, preserved at the Library University in Dresden. The copy is undated, and the manuscript of the second part of Dneprovskaya rusalka, held at the Santa Cecilia Conservatory in Rome, which is also undated, likely datable around 1804-1805. This comparison focused on identifying the complete structural musical apparatus used to set the lyrical text to music. Hensler's text on the left and Krasnopolsk's text in Russian on the right. We can generally say, regarding the treatment of the textual source, that the selection of parts set to music by the composers follow the conventions typical for the Singspiel, as to say, only close numbers, arias, duets, and trios are set to music, either by Kauer himself in the Vienna original and by Davidov and Kavos in the Russian adaptation. Dialogues and recitativos are generally omitted from the Mise en Musique. In the case study of the second Giust, the second part of the Dneprovskaya rusalka, both in the Vienna and Petersburg musical rendering, a clear pattern can be observed. In the first scene of Act 1, as I'm showing here to you, all textual components are carefully set to music, including both close numbers and dialogues. However, starting from scene 2 of the same act, only the close numbers are set to music. The dialogues appear to be intended for spoken delivery as for the Singspiel tradition. One particularly noteworthy detail concerns the recitatives introducing the choral numbers that close each act. These recitativos are in fact set to music by Kauer, and the same choice is to be observed in the transposition of Davidov. This reflects a broader tendency to evoke the atmosphere of an opera seria in act finales, which are often expanded in terms of vocal forces, duration, and orchestral writing, aiming to kind of elevate the genre of opera comicheskaya, giving it a breath of solemnity and musical complexity at the end of the acts. This standpoint allows us to highlight a particular episode to be found in the Roman manuscript of the second part of the Rusalka, where practical performance needs seem to override the otherwise consistent criteria for selecting which sections to be set to music. Specifically, the recitativo of Liesta in Act 3, just before the opera's final choral number, was indeed set to music, both by Kauer and Davidov. However, it was omitted during subsequent stagings, probably due to considerations such as overall duration and balance among the sections of the piece. This is evidenced by the manuscript source I am sharing with you now, where we can clearly see the recitative crossed out. So earlier we discussed how the inclusion of musical numbers thematically inspired by materials drawn from the Russian folklore, together with other elements of a more scenic nature, was key to the spectacular success of the piece. We now turn to two practical examples emerging from an initial analysis that, however, calls for further study in a research work that I'm doing on this topic. Let's have a look now to Liesta's aria at the beginning of Act 2, «Счастлив в свете тот супруг, кто любим своей женой». This moment, the moment of the composition of this aria, can be inscribed in a significant institutional transition. The directorship of the position of Kapellmeister and director passes between 1803-1804 from Davidov to the Italian composer Kavos. Therefore, it's Kavos' turn to now contribute to the adaptation of the German source of Rusalka in order to hand it to the Russian audience. In composing Liesta's new aria, which replaces Kauer's original Glücklich ist der Ehemann, der ein holdes Weib gewann, Kavos employs what we might jokingly call the easy win strategy. His attempt, within the broader framework of the Sklaniny na Ruskiej Prawie, adaptation to Russian uses, is to infuse the musical apparatus with a local color, as described by Yuri Keldysh. A similar process had already taken place in the first part of the opera in 1803 by Davidov. So Kavos, lacking a personal, natural cultural connection to widely recognizable Russian traditions, turns instead to a documented and increasingly appreciated source, one that, in true romantic fashion, had only recently begun to take shape. I'm referring here to the collection and publications of compounds of Narodnie Piesni, or popular songs, drawn for the historical folk music heritage shared by the peoples of the Russian Empire. For Liesta's aria in Act 2, Kavos chooses to model the melodic structure on the folk song Oli Koleya Pridyusa Ljubila Ljubila. This source appears in a collection of folk songs published by Trutowski in 1796 in St. Petersburg, the Sabranie ruskich prostych piesien z notami. When examining the opening lines, one immediately recognizes the rhythmic and melodic structure echoed in Kavos's aria. To this, he adds a charming chromatic playfulness, which, while remaining brief and simple, nonetheless evokes the Italian bel canto style, so beloved for its virtuosic flourishes and inventive musicality. Remaining in the frame of this musical number, let's move on what might seem a practical, concrete peculiarity belonging to the process of material creation of this source. The introducing overture in D major of this aria, of this piece, is transcribed faithfully and remains identical to the German version. After that, the apparent transcription of the old Kauer's aria begins. However, the transcription remains incomplete. It halts at an unresolved cadence with no final bar lines or indicators suggesting formal conclusions. Moreover, the absence of the instrumental designations in the orchestrations of singing roles, the lack of performance annotations, and the absence of the lyrics for singing all suggest that in the act of manual copying, the copyist of the score may have gotten carried away and transcribed one piece too many from Kauer's German source. Another plausible hypothesis is that Kavos was composing the new locally colored pieces progressively as the Russified re-edition of the Donauweibchen was actually taking shape through the process of copying. The comparison between the sources, always in the case of this music number, allows us for a deeper level of analysis. At first glance, one might assume that Kavos deliberately introduced this element of local music color from scratch. What we observe instead is an attempt to match or perhaps even mirror the kind of reference provided by Kauer, who had drawn upon a melody that was already widely known and recognizable to the audience, at least as a kind of musical reminiscence. Let us return then to the score of the German Donauweibchen that you now see on the left. Hulda's aria, as you say, the old Liesta's aria, begins with a striking and highly recognizable melodic gesture. From both a melodic and structural standpoint, one can clearly discern an echo of the opening theme of Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, K525, particularly in the initial phrase. In short, what we observe is a substitution of one form of popular material with another. It therefore becomes natural to split the notion of popular or narodny into two layers. For both composers, the term does not refer exclusively to a proto-nationalist reminiscence of folk heritage, but it also connects to another meaning of popular, that which is widely known, easy recognizable, and familiar to the general public, much in the same way we might speak of today's pop music. Another example, again drawn from the Roman manuscript of the second part of Rusalka, shows how Kavos' second substitution, this time within a duet between the characters Tarabar and Liesta, was likely carried out with the intention of mirroring Kauer's original musical writing. This remains a hypothesis to be verified, but a comparison between the two opening melodic gestures reveals a certain affinity. Both begin with an ascending sixth major interval. However, the metric indication differs, 3/4 time in the German version and 2/4 time in the Russian adaptation. I should reiterate that this remains a hypothesis based on an initial direct observation of the source. It would be a pleasure to explore it further to verify through more detailed analysis. To conclude, Rusalka's extraordinary success can be largely attributed to the popularity of its music. Popular both in the sense of being rooted in folk tradition and in the broader sense of being widely accessible and appealing. As Vladimir Ushakov observed in 1829 in the Moskovsky Telegraph, The national melodies, which Kavos and Davidov knew how to use so skillfully, are far more likely to please the general taste of Russian theater goers than the learned masterpieces of Gluck, Piccini, Salieri, Sacchini, and 1,000 others. Furthermore, the encounter with his manuscript and other direct primary sources opens the way to further research, both in terms of historical contextualization and of critical musical analysis, on a repertoire that, while long overshadowed by later canonical works, offers valuable insight into the aesthetic trends and cultural negotiations of the Petersburg of its time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Because we're so short on time, I'm going to invite 2 questions. I'm going to start with the hall. If there are any questions in the hall? We have a question for you from the hall, Andrea.
Hello, Andrea. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting paper. I'm interested aspect of this version of the opera that you're discussing. I'm wondering if you've discovered any other kinds of Russian folk music or Russian folkloric elements, such as rhythms or melodies, as you've been sort of working through the manuscript.
Right. For sure, some other correspondences between the newly composed music and the folk national heritage are to be found in the first part of this saga. So the Pierwszy Giust of the Rusalka, composed by Davidov. My research is actually focusing on the second part. I started focusing on the first 2 examples. For sure, the Kavos new compositions are influenced by either the actual folk themes to be found in these compilations, in romantic compounds of folk songs, or influenced by the structure and the formal composition of a folk song. So third intervals, musically speaking, actually finding the correspondences between actual folk songs and new composition in the Rusalka are still to be further in-depth studied in my research. So, but for sure.
Yeah, very cool. Really, really interesting work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions in the room? No. Any questions online? Because otherwise I have a question. No, I can't see anyone's hand up. Go online. My question is actually to all 3 of you. So Anna, and Andrea. I don't mind. My interest is actually coming as a performer. So you're looking at how the evolution of society and migration, all these issues of veracity and intentionality come together as kind of an evolving process. And I'm wondering, what is the most interesting aspect for you as musicologists when you see the trajectory of how a piece has changed? And what challenges do you think that might throw out to a performer that just wants to have a definitive version because they have to do it now and they can only do the one panoramic snapshot of how it's changed?
If I may, the question was not so clear because there were some interferences, so I hope I got the answer. You were asking about those performative aspects that can be inferred after studying this course.
But also performers with them, because performers like to have one version, and it's really exciting how this version can be seen to change according to society, according to migration and cultures and things. How do you make that balance, and what do you wish performers would take a bit more from what you're seeing about the evolution of the work in this way?
Okay, I can answer starting from my personal experience, so I had the possibility of studying the source related to Ivan Susanin, which has a shorter tradition if compared to that of Rusalka. I think that we can infer some performative aspects more in reference to the relationship between the score and the composer, who was actually the performer in the sense that he was the conductor so the cembalist, the main person directing the orchestra at that time. I think this can change. Okay, what we can infer is that at this stage, this repertoire, of course, scores are more open, so they leave some room for imagination, because the most part of the performative direction are not written in the score. And in the case of Kavos, for instance, they are related to the fact that he was the conductor, so he was a composer, so he knew by heart his own scores, and he didn't need for direction to be written on the score. In one case, I had troubles in transcribing one of the numbers of Ivan Susanin, which is an aria for the soprano, for the main soprano, Masha. And there was a curious but actually frequent peculiarity in the score, because in the main witness there are two scores, but in the main witness we have it's a duet between the first soprano and the second soprano, which is Roland Travesti for Alexei, and the part of one of the two soprano is written in a different tonality if compared to the other part, and which sounds like very, very impossible at this time, of course. And this derives from the habit of transcribing and tailoring the tonalities according to the register of the singer. On the other part, while studying the materials relating to composer and conductors, Kavos, and didactic and teacher, Kavos as a teacher, we can find some letters in which he explains that among his singer pupils, because he taught also at the Teatr Ucidice, and he had singers, so who were in a way students when they performed this kind of repertoire, he writes they needed assistance in order to complete their parts, to study their parts, because they were not complete artists. And there are some variations so he refers to need for assistance to them as not complete artists. And on the other side, he adapts the tonalities, at least in this case, because the other source confirms that this mistake of the copy is dependent on the fact that the duet was notated somewhere else, and we do not have these witnesses in one tonality, and with a difference of, can't remember whether it was F or G, but one tone difference. So these are the aspects that we can infer. And also there are some notational aspects that were particularly interesting for me, because there are specific gestures of the orchestra, for instance, when you have staccato following by an accented chords, that are notated differently in the score. So in one moment they are notated, or embellishments that are notated with one system. So there is no standard, but it seems, if we consider the whole score, it seems that I actually refer to the same gesture. And this depends, again, I think, because of the fact that this score did not circulate in other theaters, apart from possible staging in Moscow, but it was under his control. So if we want to compare with Verdi's habits, he wanted everything to be written because he knew that the performance was in a way a vehicle for his own reputation, and he wanted his scores to be actually performed by other directors exact in the same condition as he expected. So we can there are several aspects on the performative side that can be inferred from this repertoire. Hope to have responded.
Thank you.
To. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's very fascinating to just hear how all these objects are living, you know, all these sort of parallel lives and giving off all these different snippets of information that also work both chronologically but also sort of time traveling. We have like one question if somebody wants. No? In that case, I want to congratulate everybody, not only in just this session, but everybody who took part in the conference. Thank you very much for